Dr. Imara Solis had been awake for 31 hours when the containment field finally held for a full 4 seconds, and in the delirious, ringing silence that followed, she understood that she had just broken a law of physics that every civilized species in the galaxy had agreed for 900 years was unbreakable. She did not celebrate. She sat down hard on the cold decking of the drive bay, put her head between her knees, and stayed there long enough that her lab partner, a wiry, perpetually anxious engineer named Teodor Kasabian, thought she'd fainted. Imara, talk to me. He was crouched beside her, one hand on her shoulder, the other still hovering over the emergency shutdown that neither of them had needed to hit, because the drive core had simply gone quiet on its own, the way a held breath finally lets go. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice came out thin and strange, stripped of everything except the enormity of what the readouts in front of her were telling her. "Tio, look at the delta V curve, look at it." Oh, he looked. He had been looking at variations of that curve for 6 years, ever since the two of them and the rest of the Kessler array. What was left of it? 41 scientists and engineers exiled to a rock at the ass end of the Perseus arm for the crime of asking questions the consortium didn't want asked. Had started this project in a converted mining tunnel with equipment scavenged from 3 decommissioned freighters and a research budget that technically did not exist because it was not supposed to exist. He had watched that curve flatline, spike into instability, and flatline again more times than he could count. This time it did neither. This time it climbed, smooth and sustained, past every theoretical ceiling anyone in known space had ever accepted as immovable, and held there, and did not tear itself apart doing it. "That's not possible," Tio said, which was, by that point in the project, such a reflexive thing to say that neither of them registered the irony of him saying it about the one time it had actually worked. "It's not possible according to Aetherian field theory," Imara said, "which every major spacefaring civilization in this galaxy has been treating as gospel for 9 centuries, because none of them ever had a reason to question it. We had a reason. We had 30 years of reasons." She pulled herself up off the deck, legs unsteady, and looked at the drive core through the reinforced viewport, a squat, ugly, jury-rigged mess of scavenged parts and custom quantum lattice housing that looked nothing like the elegant, silent Aetherian gravitic drives that powered every ship in Consortium space, and which had 4 seconds ago done something no Aetherian drive had ever done. "We just broke the speed limit, Tio. And nobody's going to believe us, because the people who could stop us from proving it are the same people who exiled us here for trying." To understand how a splinter population of 11,000 humans ended up marooned on a barely terraformed rock called Kessler's Reach, orbiting a dim orange dwarf at the furthest habitable edge of Consortium space, you had to understand what had happened on Earth 91 years earlier, when the Aetherian Consortium first made formal contact and human civilization discovered, in the space of 18 brutal months, that it was not the most advanced species in its own galactic neighborhood. It was one of the least advanced, and it had been noticed by a coalition of 11 species who had, between them, been navigating the stars on gravitic drives for over 800 years. The consortium had not come to conquer. That was, everyone agreed even now, the strange mercy of the whole arrangement. They had come to catalog, absorb, and regulate, offering humanity membership in their vast, orderly, technologically stratified civilization in exchange for compliance with consortium law, consortium trade regulation, and most consequentially, consortium technological doctrine. And consortium technological doctrine held, as an article of near-religious certainty, that Aetherian field theory represented the fundamental, unbreakable ceiling on faster-than-light travel, a ceiling that had been mathematically proven, tested across 11 species and 9 centuries, and which no civilization within the consortium was permitted to attempt to circumvent, because early consortium history included exactly one catastrophic incident 400 years prior, in which an experimental drive built by an ambitious minor species had failed catastrophically and unraveled a section of local spacetime badly enough to sterilize an entire star system. The ban on unlicensed FTL research was not bureaucratic caution. It was trauma turned into law, and it had held uncontested for 4 centuries. Humanity in its first decades under consortium oversight mostly accepted the arrangement, because the alternative, refusal, resistance, war. Against a coalition of 11 technologically superior species, was not survivable, and everyone with any sense understood that. But a minority did not accept it, and that minority was disproportionately composed of exactly the kind of people who had built human civilizations, fastest-growing technology sectors before the consortium arrived. Physicists, engineers, systems theorists, people who looked at Aetherian field theory's supposedly unbreakable ceiling and saw, instead of settled physics, an assumption that had simply never been seriously challenged, because no one who could challenge it had ever been desperate enough to try. Amara Solis had been 26 years old, 3 years into a doctorate in exotic field mechanics at a research institute in what used to be called Geneva, when consortium enforcement agents shut the institute's Advanced Propulsion Research Division down entirely, citing violations of the unlicensed FTL research ban that the institute's own department head hadn't even known applied to their work. She watched armed consortium enforcement drones, sleek, silent, utterly untroubled by human protest, physically seal the laboratory doors while her research supervisor, a stubborn, brilliant old woman named Professor Aveline Duchamp, stood in the corridor arguing in increasingly furious and increasingly futile terms that theoretical research was not the same thing as an operational drive and that the ban's language did not actually cover what they were doing. It didn't matter. The consortium's interpretation of its own law was, by treaty, final and unappealable, and 6 months later, Professor Duchamp and 140 other human researchers and engineers flagged by consortium monitoring algorithms as persistent risks to technological compliance were formally exiled, not imprisoned, not executed. The consortium was scrupulous about the distinction, and would remain scrupulous about it for the rest of the story that followed. Relocated under permanent supervision to a barely terraformed research colony at the furthest habitable fringe of consortium space. A world with breathable but thin atmosphere, punishing seasonal storms, and just enough native resources to support a population that was, officially, engaged in approved agricultural and materials science research, and was unofficially watched by a standing consortium monitoring satellite that logged every significant power draw on the planet's surface and reported it back to a regional compliance office 4 jumps away. The transport that carried the first wave of exiles out to Kessler's reach was a converted consortium bulk hauler with none of the amenities that Aetherian passenger vessels normally offered, because the consortium did not classify the exiles as passengers, only as cargo requiring relocation, and the 11-week transit slow, even by the standards of Aetherian gravitic drives, because the hauler had been assigned the lowest routing priority available. Gave the exiles their first real look at exactly how thoroughly the consortium intended to erase their prior lives. Personal effects were limited to a single case per person. Research materials, notes, equipment, anything that could plausibly be construed as advanced technological knowledge was confiscated at the departure dock, and the exiles were told would be archived by consortium authorities, though none of them ever saw so much as a page of it again. Professor Duchamp spent most of that 11-week transit in the hauler's cramped common area, not despairing, but doing what she had apparently decided, somewhere in the first days after her lab was sealed, was the only useful thing left to do: teaching. She held informal seminars for anyone who wanted to attend, reconstructing from memory alone entire branches of exotic field theory that the consortium had just tried to strip from her, because she understood long before anyone else on that transport did that the one thing the consortium could not confiscate was what was already inside someone's head, and she intended to make sure as much of it as possible got copied into other heads before they ever set foot on Kessler's reach. Kessler's reach itself, when the exiles finally arrived, was worse than most of them had let themselves imagine. The colony's existing infrastructure, built decades earlier for a small, voluntary population of terraforming researchers who had mostly since relocated to more hospitable postings, was barely sufficient for the several hundred people already living there, let alone the sudden influx of 141 exiles with no agricultural training, no experience with the planet's punishing seasonal storm cycles, and a standing consortium monitoring presence that made clear from the first week that this was not a temporary posting anyone should expect to end. Imara's first 6 months on the planet were spent, not doing physics, but learning to repair ATM. Ospheric scrubbers and reinforced storm shelters, because a colony that could not keep its population alive through the twice-yearly superstorm season had no future worth doing physics for. And she remembered, decades later, that period as the one during which she had come closest to simply giving up on the idea that any of them would ever get to do meaningful work again. It was Duchamp, characteristically, who refused to let that despair calcify into permanence. 18 months into the exile, with the colony's basic survival infrastructure finally stabilized, she began, quietly and carefully, rebuilding something resembling a research program. Not the ambitious advanced propulsion work that had gotten her exiled, not at first, but small, deniable materials science projects that could plausibly be justified under the colony's official research mandate, while also gradually re-establishing the disciplined experimental habits and institutional muscle memory that any serious physics program required. It took another 3 years of that patient, camouflaged groundwork before Duchamp judged the colony's position secure enough, and the regional compliance office's attention complacent enough, to quietly requisition the converted equipment shed and begin, in earnest, the work that had gotten her exiled in the first place. Imara went with Duchamp, not because she was on the exile list. She wasn't, not that first round, but because she refused to watch her mentor be shipped off to a research prison at the edge of nowhere, while she stayed behind in a career that no longer meant anything to her. Teodor Kasabian, then a junior propulsion engineer with a young family, and by his own later admission, considerably more sense than Imara, followed 2 years after that. Once the consortium's compliance sweeps had worked their way through enough of human academia that there was very little left in his field worth staying for. By the time the Kessler array's population stabilized at just over 11,000 exiles, their families, and the second generation born on a world that most of them had never chosen and could never leave, the colony had developed the particular hardened culture of a community that had been told, explicitly and repeatedly, that its curiosity was a crime, and had decided, mostly in whispers at first and then increasingly out loud, that it did not intend to keep agreeing with that verdict. The unlicensed research program that eventually produced the quantum drive began, in its earliest form 9 years before that 4-second containment field held, in a converted equipment shed that Duchamp had quietly requisitioned under the colony's official mandate to conduct materials stress testing. A designation vague enough to survive a compliance audit and specific enough that nobody in the regional consortium office ever thought to ask exactly what materials were being stressed, or how. Duchamp did not live to see the drive work. She died 4 years into the project, of a degenerative lung condition that the colony's underfunded, chronically undersupplied medical facility had never had the equipment to properly treat. A condition that on any consortium world with proper medical infrastructure would have been a minor, manageable inconvenience rather than a slow, grinding death. A fact Imara found in the years that followed, she was never quite able to forgive the consortium for. Whatever restitution the tribunal eventually offered. Duchamp spent her final months unable to leave her small colony quarters, breathing through a scavenged oxygen concentrator that Teo rebuilt twice with parts cannibalized from equipment never meant to keep a person alive, and even then propped up in bed with barely enough air to speak in full sentences. She insisted on reviewing the team's latest containment field data every single day, dictating corrections to whoever was willing to sit with her and transcribe, because she had decided, somewhere in that long decline, that the project mattered more than her own comfort, and nobody who loved her ever found a way to talk her out of that conviction. Her last coherent instruction to Amara, delivered in that same hospital bed with monitoring equipment scavenged from a decommissioned mining rig, was simple and absolute. Don't let them win by making you afraid of the math, Amara. The math doesn't care whose colony it was proven in. Finish it. It took Amara and the 11 researchers who remained committed to the project. The rest had either lost their nerve as consortium compliance sweeps grew more aggressive across the exile colonies, or had quietly decided that the risk of discovery, which the consortium's own penal code specified as summary planetary quarantine and confiscation of all colony technological assets, was simply too high a price for a theory that might not even be correct. Another 5 years to get from Duchamp's death to a containment field that held for F. Our seconds, 5 years of research conducted almost entirely at night, in shifts, in a facility with its power draw deliberately staggered and disguised across a dozen different official colony systems, so that the consortium monitoring satellites' automated compliance algorithms would never see a spike large enough to trigger a manual review. 5 years of failures that ranged from merely disappointing to genuinely, catastrophically dangerous. An early prototype containment failure 18 months into the renewed effort had breached a section of the converted mining tunnel with a burst of exotic radiation that gave 3 researchers radiation sickness severe enough that Amara had spent 2 sleepless weeks, convinced she was about to have to explain to a consortium medical inspection team why colony personnel were presenting with injuries that no approved agricultural research project could plausibly produce. The team learned over those 5 years to live inside a particular kind of exhausting duality that never fully left any of them even decades later. By day, they were agricultural researchers, materials scientists, colony administrators, people who filed the correct reports and attended the correct compliance reviews, and gave every outward appearance of a population that had accepted its diminished place in the consortium's order. By night, in shifts that rotated so that no single researcher's absence pattern would look statistically anomalous to the monitoring satellite's behavioral algorithms, they were something else entirely. The last living continuation of a line of inquiry, the most powerful civilization in known space had declared permanently closed. Teodor Kasabian, still years from watching his daughter fly the drive he was helping build, spent those 5 years splitting his attention between the project and the 2 small children he was raising alone after his wife's death in a farming accident during the colony's 2nd year. And he would say later that the strange gift of the double life was that it never let him sit still long enough to properly grieve, which he understood even then was not healthy, and did anyway. Because the alternative felt like letting the consortium win twice. The instability problem that dominated those 5 years was, at its core, a problem of precision that the colony's scavenged, jury-rigged equipment was never designed to solve. Aetherian gravitic drives, built by species with 8 centuries of institutional manufacturing expertise, achieved their reliability through components machined to tolerances the Kessler array's cobbled-together fabrication shop could not remotely match. Every quantum lattice housing the team built by hand, sanding and calibrating components, meant for entirely different purposes into something that could plausibly hold a probabilistic superposition stable. And every one of them failed slightly differently, which meant every failure taught them something new about a category of physics nobody else in the galaxy had ever needed to characterize this precisely. Because nobody else had ever needed a drive that worked when built by people with no proper machine shop, no cleanroom fabrication, and no institutional safety margin at all. Amara kept a private conviction, one she rarely spoke aloud even to Tio, that the eventual breakthrough owed as much to that constraint as it did to any theoretical elegance, that a team forced to build with imperfect tools had been forced, in the process, to understand the underlying physics more completely than a team that could simply engineer around its own ignorance the way consortium research divisions, flush with resources, had always been able to do. They got away with it, that time and every time after, through a combination of careful compartmentalization, forged materials requisitions, and the simple, grinding luck of a consortium bureaucracy that had never seriously imagined a supposedly cowed exile population would actually attempt what the ban existed to prevent. But luck was never something Imara let herself rely on, and in the years after the 4-second breakthrough, as the drive moved from theoretical proof to something that might, conceivably, actually fly, she understood with total clarity that the colony's entire population was now sitting on a discovery that the consortium would consider, without any exaggeration at all, an existential threat to 4 centuries of settled law and 400 years of carefully maintained peace between 11 species, who had built their entire strategic balance of power around the shared, comfortable assumption that nobody could go faster than an Aetherian drive. The drive worked, in its final, refined form, on a principle that Aetherian field theory had never seriously considered, because Aetherian field theory had been built by species whose baseline understanding of quantum mechanics had solidified around a mathematical framework that treated certain n categories of quantum uncertainty as noise to be filtered out rather than structure to be exploited. Imara's breakthrough, and she would spend the rest of her life mildly annoyed that history insisted on calling it hers alone, when it had been built on Duchamp's original theoretical framework and refined by 11 other researchers whose names deserved equal billing, was recognizing that a sufficiently precise quantum lattice, held in a state of engineered probabilistic superposition across a starship's entire structural mass, could be made to choose. In the strange non-classical sense that quantum systems chose anything, a space-time displacement that Aetherian gravitic drives could only approximate through brute continuous thrust. It was not, strictly speaking, faster-than-light travel in the sense the band's authors had been afraid of. It was closer to a series of extraordinarily precise, extraordinarily rapid quantum tunneling events, a ship effectively existing in 2 locations separated by immense distance for a vanishingly small interval before probability collapsed it fully into the second location, over and over, thousands of times a second, producing an effective velocity that made the fastest Aetherian gravitic drive in consortium service look, by comparison, like it was standing still. It was also, and this was the part that kept Imara awake more nights than the fear of discovery ever did, considerably more dangerous than anything in consortium service, because a quantum tunneling event that failed to collapse cleanly did not produce a gentle engine stall. It produced, in the earliest and most catastrophic prototype failure, 11 months before the first crude test, a ship-sized chunk of the test vessel's engineering section simply ceasing to have a coherent probabilistic address in spacetime at all, smeared across a volume of space roughly the size of a small moon in a way that the colony's sensors could detect but not meaningfully describe, and which took 4 more months of frantic, terrified refinement to ensure would never happen again. 2 engineers died in that failure, close enough to the test vessel that their bodies were never recovered in any conventional sense, and Imara carried their names, the way she had learned to carry every cost the project extracted, in a private ledger she updated personally and showed to almost no one, because she had promised herself, standing in the wreckage of that failed test, that she would never let the colony forget what the drive had already cost before it ever flew a single successful mission. The first crude test flight, 11 years after Imara's 4-second containment breakthrough and 20 years after the project's earliest beginnings in Duchamp's converted equipment shed, was flown by Teodor Kasabian's eldest daughter, Anya, a pilot who had been 6 years old when her father followed Duchamp into exile and had grown up entirely inside a colony culture that treated the forbidden math not as a crime but as an inheritance. In the 2 years leading up to that flight, Anya had logged more simulator hours on the quantum drive's control interface than any pilot in consortium space had logged on any drive system in history, not because the colony had abundant training resources. It emphatically did not, but because she had spent nearly every waking hour outside her official colony duties in a cramped simulator rig Tio had built from salvaged flight control components. running failure scenario after failure scenario until her responses to a containment fluctuation warning were faster than conscious thought, because she understood, better than almost anyone else in the colony, exactly how unforgiving the physics she was about to fly would be if she hesitated even a fraction of a second at the wrong moment. She took the refitted courier vessel Vindication, a name the Colony Council had debated for weeks, half of them arguing it was too provocative for a project that depended entirely on staying hidden out past the Kessler system's outer debris ring, beyond the effective sensor range of the Consortium monitoring satellite, and initiated the quantum drive sequence with a crew of 4 and a colony's entire hope riding on a containment field that had by that point held successfully in 18 consecutive unmanned tests, but had never once been tested with living crew aboard. In the control room back on Kessler's reach, Imara stood with both hands pressed flat against the console edge, watching a telemetry feed that would, if the drive failed the way the earliest catastrophic prototype had failed 11 months before, simply stop transmitting without any warning at all, because a ship that lost coherent probabilistic address in spacetime did not have time to broadcast a distress call first. The moment of activation, when it came, produced no dramatic flash on the telemetry feed, no visible discontinuity that the control room's sensors could enter into anything as clean as an image, only a sudden, vertiginous jump in the Vindication's logged position that made the tracking display briefly flicker and recalibrate, as though the software itself needed a moment to accept what it was being told. Then the feed steadied and steadied again and kept steadying second after second, well past the 4-second mark that had once felt like the outer edge of what any of them dared to hope for. And the room went very quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when 40 people are all simultaneously too afraid to be the one who jinxes it by speaking first. The flight lasted 11 minutes, ship's time, and covered a distance that would have taken the fastest Aetherian gravitic drive in Consortium service more than 4 months to traverse. Anya Kasabian brought the Vindication back into Kessler system orbit with her hands shaking so badly she could barely release the flight controls, her crew alternately laughing and weeping in a way that the ship's recorder would later capture, with an intensity that made even the colony's most hardened engineers tear up watching the playback. And the first thing she said over the comm channel to a control room packed with every researcher who had spent a decade or more of their exiled lives on this exact moment was simple, and would become, in the years that followed, the closest thing the Kessler array ever had to a founding motto. It works. Oh God, it actually works. Tell them we're not asking permission anymore. Imara did not remember, afterward, exactly how long she stood frozen at the console before she moved. Only that when she finally did move, it was to find Tio, who had spent the entire flight sitting motionless in the chair nearest the telemetry feed with an expression that had nothing left in it but raw, unguarded terror for his daughter. And the two of them held onto each other in the middle of a control room full of people crying and shouting and hugging strangers. The 20 years of fear and grief and stubborn, unkillable work finally all at once, given somewhere to go. Somewhere in the celebration that followed, someone found a bottle of colony-distilled spirits that had apparently been saved for exactly this occasion for longer than most of the younger researchers had been alive. And the whole team stayed awake until dawn, not planning next steps, not discussing strategy, just sitting together in the wreckage of 2 decades of exile, letting themselves, for one single night, feel like the thing they had built actually meant what they had always hoped it would mean. The consortium found out 4 months later, not through any failure of the colony's careful secrecy, but through the simple, unavoidable mathematics of what a functioning quantum drive actually did to a colony's economy once its population started, quietly and then with increasing boldness, using it. A 20-year exile project does not stay a secret forever once its output starts appearing on trade manifests, and a regional compliance office that had spent decades treating Kessler's reach as an irrelevant, thoroughly monitored backwater began, in the 5th month after Vindication's first flight, Receiving anomalous reports of Kessler-registered vessels appearing in trade contexts they had no plausible Aetherian drive transit time to have reached. The first flags were minor, a Kessler trade envoy showing up at a consortium way station 3 weeks earlier than any recorded departure time could account for, a shipment manifest with timestamps that made no sense against the colony's registered vessel speeds, small enough that a less paranoid administrative apparatus might have written them off as clerical error. The consortium did not have that kind of apparatus. 4 centuries of maintaining an absolute technological ceiling had built, into every layer of consortium bureaucracy, an institutional reflex for treating exactly this kind of anomaly as the most serious possible category of concern. And the investigation that followed moved with a speed that surprised even the colony's own intelligence-gathering efforts, modest as those efforts necessarily were. The investigation that followed was, by consortium standards, remarkably fast, 11 weeks from first anomaly report to a full compliance fleet, 6 cruisers strong, translating into Kessler system space with formal orders to quarantine the colony, confiscate all technological assets, and detain the entire population pending a tribunal review that everyone in the colony understood without needing it spelled out, would not end with anyone going home. The colony had exactly 9 days of warning before the fleet's arrival, enough time for a Kessler-registered courier running the quantum drive to make a round trip to a neighboring system and back with intelligence suggesting the compliance fleet's movement, but not nearly enough time to evacuate a population of 11,000 people, or to meaningfully harden a colony whose entire defensive posture had, for 2 decades, depended on staying beneath consortium notice rather than surviving direct confrontation with it. Imara spent those 9 days in a state she would later describe as the strangest calm of her entire life, not because she wasn't afraid. She was more afraid than she had been at any point since the earliest catastrophic test failure that killed 2 of her researchers, but because for the first time in 20 years, the choice in front of her was no longer about concealment. There was nothing left to conceal. The only question left was what the colony did with what it had built, now that hiding it was no longer an option. The Colony Council met in continuous session for most of those 9 days, and the debate that ran through them was fiercer and more fractured than anything the exile community had faced since its earliest, most desperate years on the planet. A significant faction, led by a materials engineer named Priya Chandrasekharan, who had lost a brother to consortium enforcement action decades earlier during the original crackdown on Earth, argued forcefully for using the drive's advantage to fight, not a suicidal stand against 6 cruisers, but a hard evacuation of the colony's most essential personnel and technological assets to unmapped space beyond even the consortium's considerable reach. Buying decades or longer before any pursuit could plausibly catch up. It was not, Imara would later admit, a foolish plan. It might even have worked. But it would have meant abandoning the several thousand colony residents who had no quantum drive vessel to evacuate on. The elderly, the very young, the sick, everyone whose survival depended on staying exactly where the compliance fleet was about to arrive. And Imara found, when it came down to the final vote, that she could not bring herself to trade 11,000 lives for the chance to protect a discovery, however hard one, however precious. Duchamp had not died so that the people who trusted her could be left behind. Imara was 51 years old by then, her hair gone fully gray in the 2 decades since Duchamp's death, and she stood in the colony's primary control center watching 6 consortium compliance cruisers arrange themselves in the same calm, procedurally confident formation the consortium always used when it expected total unresisted compliance from whatever minor population it was currently correcting. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after 20 years of fear, that the colony had exactly one choice left to make, and it needed to be made in the next several minutes. "They're transmitting the quarantine order," said Rafael Nunez, the colony's communications lead, his voice tight, reading off a translated feed that scrolled across the main display in the flat, procedurally formal consortium diplomatic register that always sounded to human ears, like it had been generated by something that had learned language from legal contracts rather than from people. Full compliance demanded within 30 minutes or they're authorized to use disabling force against any vessel attempting to leave orbit. Imara, they've got weapons hot on every registered Kessler vessel in orbital range. This isn't posturing. How many ships do we have flight-ready with the quantum drive installed? Imara asked. And she was aware, even as she asked it, of how many people in that control room were looking at her the way people look at someone they have decided, without ever formally voting on it, is in charge, a weight she had never asked for and had spent 20 years slowly, reluctantly growing into anyway. 9, Anya Kasabian said. From the pilot station she had more or less permanently claimed since Vindication's first flight, her voice steadier than anyone in that room had any right to expect from a 28-year-old pilot staring down 6 warships. 9 ships, full quantum retrofit. Everything else is still running Aetherian gravitic, which means everything else is exactly as fast as anything they've got and slower than most of it. Then here's what we do, Imara said. And she was surprised, even as she said it, by how steady her own voice came out, because inside she did not feel steady at all. She felt mostly the accumulated weight of every name in her private ledger. Every cost the project had already extracted long before this moment arrived, and a fierce, protective fury on behalf of 11,000 people who had spent 20 years being told their curiosity was a crime and were now, in the space of 30 minutes, about to be told it one final time permanently unless they did something about it. We are not going to fight 6 consortium cruisers with 9 light retrofit vessels. That's not a battle, that's a massacre, and I am not sending Anya or anyone else's children to die proving a point we can prove a better way. We're going to do something the consortium has never had to plan for, because nobody they've ever quarantined has ever had a drive that could outrun the quarantine order faster than the order could even finish transmitting. The plan, worked out in the 11 remaining minutes before the consortium fleet's deadline, was as audacious as anything the colony had attempted in 20 years of clandestine research, and it depended entirely on a capability that nobody outside the 9 quantum retrofitted ships' small circle of pilots and engineers had ever seen demonstrated. Not evasion, not combat, but a kind of overwhelming, incomprehensible logistical impossibility, deployed all at once, in full view of a consortium compliance fleet that had never had to imagine an adversary who could simply be in 6 places faster than their sensors could process the fact that the enemy vessel had moved at all. Every pilot who volunteered for the run understood, when Imara laid out the plan in the 11 minutes they had left, that a single miscalculation, a jump sequence timed a fraction of a second wrong, a targeting solution from a startled cruiser gunner faster than anyone had accounted for meant dying at point-blank range from a warship with no reason left to show restraint. Every one of them volunteered anyway, and Imara would spend years afterward unable to fully explain, even to herself, how a colony that had spent 2 decades being systematically taught to be afraid had produced, in the space of a single generation, 9 pilots willing to fly directly at the guns of a fleet sent to erase them. Anya herself, briefing her own crew in the 90 seconds before launch, kept the instructions as simple as she could make them, because there was no time left for anything more. Hold the jump timing exactly as drilled, transmit the data burst the instant proximity confirmed, and trust that a fleet built on 4 centuries of procedural caution would need at least a few seconds longer than any of them had to spare in order to decide that firing on an unarmed, non-hostile contact was worth the diplomatic reckoning that would follow. 9 quantum drive ships launched simultaneously from Kessler's Reach's surface facilities, and instead of scattering for deep space and hoping to outrun 6 cruisers that could not in fact catch them, they did something that the consortium fleet's tactical AI took nearly 90 seconds to even properly register as a coherent pattern. They flickered. Ship after ship executing quantum jump sequences at a tempo the fleet's sensors initially logged as impossible sensor error, appearing at point-blank range alongside each consortium cruiser in turn, close enough to transmit a direct hardline data burst before jumping away again before the cruiser's weapon systems could even complete a targeting lock. And the data burst each cruiser received was not a threat, not a demand, but something considerably stranger and considerably more effective. Full technical documentation of the quantum drive itself, unredacted, complete, offered freely and without condition, transmitted directly into the command systems of the very fleet that had come to confiscate and destroy it. Aboard the cruiser Threl Ascendant, Fleet Commander Asa Vantry's own tactical officer, a younger Threl named Corvin Ash who had never in his career seen a hostile contact behave in any pattern his training had not anticipated, watched his targeting display cycle through 6 failed lock attempts in under 2 minutes, and said in a voice that had entirely lost its professional composure, "Commander, I cannot get a firing solution. The target isn't evading. It isn't where the weapons system predicts it will be, and then it's gone, and then it's somewhere else that also doesn't match any predictive model I have access to. Commander, I don't think this is a targeting problem. I think this is a physics problem." Across the rest of the fleet, the same scene repeated itself with only minor variation, gunnery crews on 5 other cruisers watching decades of rigorous consortium weapons. Training simply failed to produce a usable answer against a target that, from the perspective of their own sensor suites, appeared to be defying causality itself rather than merely moving quickly. And more than one crew member later admitted, in private conversations that never made it into any official record, that the experience had been less like combat than like watching the universe itself glitch, a feeling none of their species' long, orderly military histories had prepared them to process calmly. It took the Consortium Compliance Fleet's commander nearly 4 minutes to understand what had just happened, and when she did, she gave an order that would later become, in Consortium military academies across all 11 member species, a case study in the exact moment an entire strategic paradigm quietly, irrevocably ended. "Belay the quarantine order, SH." E said, her voice carrying a controlled professional calm that did not remotely reflect what she actually felt in that moment, which was something considerably closer to vertigo. "Confirm receipt of the transmitted data. Advise Regional Command that Kessler's Reach's technological capability has just been demonstrated to render 6 cruisers of standard Aetherian design tactically obsolete against a target that does not require evasion because it can simply choose not to be wherever we are aiming." Imara's reasoning, explained later in exhaustive detail to a consortium tribunal that convened not to punish the colony, but to determine with genuine and unprecedented urgency how the consortium's entire technological and legal order should adapt to a discovery it could no longer suppress, was simpler than the tribunal initially wanted to believe. The ban on unlicensed FTL research had never actually been about preventing catastrophe. Not really, not after the first few decades. It had calcified, over 4 centuries, into something closer to a mechanism for preserving the existing balance of power among the 11 founding consortium species. A balance built on the assumption that Aetherian field theory's ceiling was permanent and universal rather than merely the limit of what those 11 species had happened to discover first. Giving the technology away freely to the very fleet sent to destroy it was not naivety. It was the only move that made a violent consortium response strategically pointless, because there was no longer a secret to suppress, no monopoly to protect through force, only a discovery that now existed simultaneously in Kessler colony records and in the command archives of a consortium compliance fleet, spreading from that moment forward. In every direction Imara no longer had any ability to control, and more importantly, no longer had any need to. The tribunal itself convened 8 weeks after the standoff at Kessler's Reach, in a vast, echoing chamber on the consortium's central administrative station that had, in 400 years, never once been called upon to hear a case remotely like it. Imara was summoned to testify not as a defendant precisely. The consortium's legal apparatus had spent most of those 8 weeks in genuine, unresolved confusion about what category of proceeding this even was. Since the crime the exiles had originally been convicted of no longer had any practical meaning, once the entire galaxy possessed the technology that crime had been defined by, but as something closer to a witness, whose testimony the tribunal's 11 presiding delegates, one from each founding species, seemed almost desperate to hear, as though understanding the reasoning behind the colony's choice might help them understand what came next for a civilization that had just watched its most fundamental technological assumption dissolve in a single afternoon. She spent 3 full tribunal sessions answering questions that ranged from the narrowly technical. Delegates from the reptilian, Severan delegation pressed her for hours on the precise mathematics of quantum lattice stabilization. Technical questions she answered patiently and completely, because she had decided, walking into that chamber for the first time, that she would never again treat this knowledge as something to be hoarded or gatekept. Not even from the civilization that had once tried to take it from her by force, to the broadly philosophical, delegates from 3 different species asking, in various forms, some version of the same underlying question. Why hadn't the Kessler array simply used its advantage to negotiate better terms for itself, to extract concessions, autonomy, formal independence, anything at all, rather than surrendering the discovery's exclusivity for nothing in return? Amara answered that question, in the end, more times than any other during those 3 sessions, and she gave, each time, some variation of the same answer, refined a little further each time she said it, until by the final session it had become something close to a formal statement she delivered from memory. "You keep asking me what we got in exchange for the drive," she told the assembled delegates, on the 3rd and final day of her testimony, standing in a chamber built for beings considerably larger than herself, feeling, for perhaps the first time in the entire 25-year arc of the project, entirely unafraid of what she was about to say. I want to answer that honestly because I think the honest answer is the only one that will actually matter in 400 years, when this tribunal is a historical footnote and the drive is just how everyone travels. We didn't get anything in exchange for it because we weren't negotiating a trade. We were trying to make sure that what happened to us could never happen to anyone else. Professor Duchamp was exiled for asking a question your consortium had decided 4 centuries ago was ungenerous to ask. She died on a colony world with medical equipment scavenged from a mining rig, still trying to answer that question because she believed, and she taught all of us to believe, that the only thing worse than the risk of a discovery like this is a civilization so afraid of its own curiosity that it would rather exile and silence anyone who goes looking for the answer. If we had kept the drive for ourselves, we would have proven your 4 centuries of doctrine right, that this kind of power, once discovered, gets hoarded, weaponized, turned into the next hierarchy's foundation. We gave it away instead because we wanted to prove the opposite. That curiosity doesn't have to become a weapon, that a discovery this large can belong to everyone without destroying everyone in the process. Whether that turns out to be true is not really up to me anymore. It's up to what the 11 of you, and everyone who comes after you, decide to do with it. The chamber was silent for a long moment after she finished, long enough that Amara wondered, with a flicker of the old exile-era anxiety she had thought she'd finally outgrown, whether she had said something the tribunal would hold against the entire colony, the same anxious, watchful stillness she remembered from every consortium compliance review of her early adulthood, the instinct to make herself small and unobjectionable in front of an authority that had once decided, with total legal finality, that her curiosity made her dangerous. Then the eldest of the 11 delegates, a slow-moving, deeply weathered representative of the consortium's founding Aetherian species itself, the species whose 4-century-old field theory the Kessler array had just quietly, comprehensively disproven, rose from his seat with visible effort and said something that the tribunal's official record would later preserve as the moment the proceedings' entire tone shifted. "Dr. Solis," he said, in a voice rendered by the translation interface as slow, careful, and entirely without the procedural coldness that had characterized most of the tribunal's earlier questioning, "My species built the ceiling you just broke. We built it honestly out of genuine catastrophe and genuine grief 400 years ago, and we have spent every year since convincing ourselves that grief was wisdom rather than fear. I do not know yet what the consortium becomes now that the ceiling is gone. But I find, listening to you, that I am no longer certain we were right to build a civilization whose safety depended on nobody ever being permitted to ask whether the ceiling could be broken. That is not something I expected to feel today. I suspect it is not something my government expected me to feel either. Fleet Commander Asa Vantry testified before the tribunal as well, in a session 2 days after Amara's, and her account of the standoff, delivered with the same rigid professional precision she had shown throughout the encounter itself, became, in its own way, just as consequential to the tribunal's eventual ruling as anything Amara said. Because Vantry did something that no consortium military officer in living memory had done in a formal tribunal proceeding. She recommended on the record against any punitive action toward the Kessler array, on the explicit grounds that a colony capable of rendering an entire compliance fleet tactically obsolete, and which had chosen in that exact moment of maximum leverage to disarm the confrontation entirely rather than exploit it, had demonstrated a form of restraint the consortium's own military doctrine did not have a category for, and which she personally found she respected more than she was entirely comfortable admitting in a formal chamber. You could have kept it, Fleet Commander Vantry said to Amara, months later, in a conversation neither of them fully expected to have, aboard a consortium diplomatic vessel anchored in Kessler system orbit while the broader tribunal process ground forward across a dozen more formal sessions. You could have used it as leverage, independence, autonomy. Any number of things a population that had just demonstrated it could outrun our entire military doctrine might reasonably have demanded before handing that advantage away. We could have, Amara agreed. And in another 6 months or a year or 5 years, some consortium research division would have quietly reverse-engineered enough of it from wreckage or intercepted data to catch up anyway. And by then we'd have spent that advantage building weapons and warships instead of spending it making sure nobody ever again gets exiled to a rock at the edge of nowhere for the crime of doing math your consortium found inconvenient. I didn't want a monopoly, Commander. Duchamp didn't die so that 11,000 people could become the new powerful species at the top of somebody else's hierarchy. She died so the hierarchy itself would have to answer for treating curiosity as a threat. Imara looked out the viewport at Kessler's reach turning slowly below them. Thin clouds streaked across its perpetually storm-battered surface. The world that had been a prison for 20 years and was becoming, in the tribunal's grudging, still unfinished deliberations, something closer to what Duchamp had always insisted it could be. Not an exile colony, but a beginning. We gave it to everyone, Commander, because a discovery that belongs to everyone can't be used to build the same kind of cage we just climbed out of. Vantry was quiet for a long moment, watching the same slow turn of the planet below, and when she spoke again, it was with something that the translation interface rendered imperfectly, as a kind of weary, professional candor she had clearly not planned to share. I have served the consortium for 81 years, Dr. Solis. I have enforced the compliance ban personally, on 3 separate occasions before this one, against minor species who never had the means to resist it the way your colony just did. I told myself each time that I was preventing a catastrophe. I still believe that, in the abstract, the ban existed because a catastrophe genuinely happened once, and genuine grief is not the same thing as bureaucratic overreach. But I watched 9 ships that could have annihilated my entire fleet choose instead to hand us the exact knowledge that made that annihilation possible freely without condition, and I find that I no longer know how to explain that choice using anything in 4 centuries of consortium military doctrine. I do not think doctrine has a category for mercy deployed as strategy. I am not certain my own species would have made the same choice if our positions had been reversed. Maybe that's the actual lesson your council should take from this, Commander, Imara said, not the physics. The physics was always going to get discovered by somebody eventually, whether it was us or someone else, because you can't ban curiosity forever, you can only exile it and hope it gives up. The lesson is that a civilization gets to choose what kind of species inherits a discovery like this. We chose to be the kind that didn't want a monopoly. I'd like to think that choice says more about who we are than the drive itself ever will. Vantry did not answer immediately. She stood at the viewport for a long time, watching the same slow turn of storm clouds across a world that 81 years of consortium service had trained her to think of, if she thought of it at all, as an irrelevant compliance footnote rather than a place where anything of consequence could ever occur. And when she finally spoke again, it was quieter and closer to something personal than anything she had said in the entire encounter that preceded it. "I have a granddaughter," she said. "Threll fledglings ask a great many questions, more than most other species tolerate well, and mine has recently taken an interest in why the sky is the color it is. A question our own species answered adequately some 6 centuries ago and has not seriously revisited since, because there has been no need to. I find, since watching your ships refuse to fire on us, that I no longer want to tell her the old answer is good enough simply because it has always been good enough before. I think I would like her to grow up in a consortium that remembers what almost happened here, and chooses, the next time someone asks a forbidden question, to wonder whether the answer might matter more than the fear of it." The Consortium Tribunal's final ruling, delivered 14 months later after a review process that fundamentally rewrote 4 centuries of settled interstellar law, did not restore the Kessler exiles to their original citizenship status, because there was, by that point, no meaningful framework left to restore them to. The old order, built on Aetherian field theory's supposed permanence, had already begun the slow, seismic process of reorganizing itself around a discovery that 11 species now had equal, simultaneous access to. And the question of what came next was bigger than any one tribunal could resolve in a single ruling. The ruling itself ran to nearly 400 pages, and the tribunal's 11 delegates spent the final 3 months of deliberation locked in disagreements that had less to do with the Kessler array specifically than with the much larger, much more uncomfortable question of what the entire consortium legal order was even for, now that the founding assumption underneath it, that Aetherian field theory represented an absolute, universal ceiling rather than merely the limit of what 11 species had happened to discover first, had been so thoroughly and publicly disproven. Several of the more conservative delegations argued, in sessions that grew heated enough that the tribunal's official record noted multiple recesses called specifically to let tempers cool, that the compliance ban itself show ULD simply be reaffirmed and extended, this time explicitly covering quantum lattice research as well as Aetherian field theory, on the grounds that a civilization which had just watched one exiled colony break a 4-century ceiling in 25 years had every reason to fear what an unrestrained research program, freed of any oversight at all, might eventually produce. That argument did not win in the end, though it came closer to winning than Amara. Watching the tribunal's proceedings from a gallery seat she had been informally granted for the duration of the review, ever felt comfortable with. What tipped the balance, according to the eventual majority opinion written in a detail that struck Amara as almost unbearably fitting, primarily by the same elderly Aetherian delegate who had spoken to her so plainly after her 3rd day of testimony, was less a legal argument than a practical one. The technology could no longer be contained even if the consortium wanted to contain it, because it now existed in the archived command systems of 6 separate consortium cruisers, distributed across a fleet whose cruise had already begun, informally and then less informally, sharing what they had learned with colleagues and family across a dozen worlds. A ban that could not actually be enforced was not a safeguard, the majority opinion concluded, in a line that would be quoted for decades afterward in consortium legal scholarship. It was only a slower, more bureaucratic way of guaranteeing that the knowledge spread in secret, unregulated, and unaccompanied by any of the safety protocols the Kessler array itself had spent 25 hard years developing. Better, the opinion argued, to bring the research fully into the light, with proper oversight, proper safety standards, and full acknowledgement of the debt the entire consortium now owed to the very population it had once tried to erase for attempting exactly that. What the tribunal did do, unanimously, in the closest thing to an apology any consortium legal body had issued in recorded history, was formally void the original exile order, restore full technological and research autonomy to Kessler's reach and every other exile colony still scattered across consortium space, and commission, at consortium expense, a permanent monument at the mining tunnel where Duchamp had first requisitioned an equipment shed for materials stress testing 25 years earlier, a small, unglamorous plaque that Amara insisted on writing herself, and which read in the end exactly as plainly as she had wanted it to. Here, a handful of people the galaxy called finished kept working anyway, and the math did not care whose colony it was proven in. In the years that followed, as quantum drive technology spread across consortium space and beyond it, reshaping trade routes and diplomatic relationships, and the basic shape of what interstellar travel even meant for 11 species who had spent 4 centuries assuming they already knew the outer limit of what was possible, Kessler's reach itself changed almost beyond recognition. The colony that had once existed to be forgotten became, instead, one of the most visited research destinations in consortium space, a place where delegations from a dozen species came to study not just the technical particulars of quantum lattice engineering, but the strange, stubborn culture that had produced it, a culture built deliberately and self-consciously around the idea that curiosity was not a threat to be managed but an inheritance to be protected. Whatever it cost to protect it. Teodor Kasabian lived to see his granddaughter, Anya's own daughter, enroll in the first formally accredited quantum propulsion academy in consortium history, built on the same storm-battered ground where he had once run failure scenario after failure scenario in a simulator rig cobbled together from salvaged flight control components. And he told anyone who would listen for the rest of his long life that the proudest moment of his career was not the day the drive finally worked, but the day he watched a consortium delegate from a species that had once voted to exile his family sit in a Kessler classroom and ask a Kessler-born 12-year-old, with genuine and unguarded curiosity, to explain how the math actually worked. Amara Solis never fully left the gravitational pull of the project that had defined most of her adult life, even after the tribunal's ruling and the years of careful institution building that followed it. And she kept, until the end of her long life, the private ledger she had started the night of the earliest catastrophic prototype failure, adding names to it less and less often as the years passed, and the technology matured into something considerably safer than the desperate, jury-rigged science that had first proven it possible, but never closing it entirely, because she had promised herself a long time ago in a hospital room with medical equip, meant scavenged from a mining rig, that she would never let the cost of the discovery become invisible just because the discovery itself had, eventually, succeeded beyond anything either she or Duchamp had ever quite dared to hope for. She spent much of her later career doing something that surprised even her closest colleagues, given how carefully she had guarded the project during its most dangerous years. She traveled extensively to a dozen other exile and penal colonies scattered across the far reaches of what had once been strictly regulated consortium space, colonies full of people convicted, under one obscure compliance statute or another, of exactly the same category of crime that had once sent her and Duchamp and 140 other researchers to a storm-battered rock at the edge of nowhere, and she made a point on every one of those visits of telling the people she met there the same thing in more or less the same words, because she had come to believe it was the truest thing she had left to offer, that whatever they had been exiled for asking, the asking itself had never been the crime worth punishing, and that somewhere on some other forgotten colony, Someone else's stubbornness was quietly proving that the doors the consortium called locked had only ever been closed. She gave her final public address at Kessler's Reach on the 50th anniversary of the tribunal's ruling, an old woman by then, standing at the same plaque she had written the words for decades earlier, her voice thinner than it had once been but no less steady, and she told the assembled crowd colonists, visiting delegates from species who had once voted to enforce her exile, students born long after that exile itself had faded into history rather than living memory. The same thing she had been telling anyone who asked for 50 years running, that the drive had never really been the point. The point had always been the 25 years of refusing to accept that a closed door was the same thing as a locked one, and she hoped, whatever came next for the crowded, ever-expanding civilization the quantum drive had helped build, that some part of that stubbornness would outlast her, because a species that stopped asking forbidden questions, she said, was a species that had already decided its own ceiling was the only one that mattered. And the math, she reminded them one final time, had never once cared whose colony it was proven in.